substituting gambling with another alternative activity. So things like spending more time with friends and family, perhaps spending more time working, just simply finding something else to do other than gambling so that they're not focused, so that they don't have time on their hands to be able to go and gamble. So yes, you can see from the last 2 dot points the various strategies that have been reported that people use in order to try to recover from gambling problems or self-regulate their gambling. Gamblers who are attempting to recover from problem gambling are more likely to use more strategies. It's thought that perhaps people who have more severe level of gambling problems will use strategies that do not rely so much on their own ability to self-regulate and are more about imposing restrictions on their behaviour. And those strategies, because they're imposing on their behaviour, they are also much more intensive strategies that really restrict access to gambling, to the money, all that stimulus control and that sort of thing that we just spoke about. So you can see here the studies have listed strategies that have been used. So we know a bit about what people do, but we don't really have a lot of insight into how they go about implementing those strategies, or why they choose those strategies, I suppose, when they implement them, by whom the strategies, how it might change over time. So that was one of the things that we're really interested in with this project. And as mentioned, we're looking at informal recovery processes. So informal recovery has also been referred to as natural recovery and spontaneous recovery. This has quite often been used in relation to young people recovering from gambling problems. There's this idea that young people might have a problem with gambling, but that's just because they're reckless youth. They live it up in their youth and then just simply somehow mature out of gambling problems, and it's a spontaneous process. And so that sort of language, I think, is most likely a misnomer. It implies that there's change through no effort. But as is demonstrated in this project, and also, as you can imagine, there is a process and there are certain circumstances that need to be there for that young person to be able to mature out, if we want to use that language, of gambling problems. And so just sort of briefly, we were really interested in young people and the way that they do recover from gambling problems. And so just briefly on what we know about young people, they're obviously at great risk of developing gambling problems. It's quite possible that there are a greater proportion of young people who have a problem with gambling than older adults. Also, young people have grown up in a very different gambling environment to most 40, 50, 60-year-olds. So the way that they interact with gambling products, their perspective of gambling products and what recovery means, what having a problem means, might be quite different for these young people. Also, the way that we sort of think of and describe gambling problems is mostly around the way that we understand an older person in their 40s, 50s, 60s perhaps, or even older, would be having gambling problems. So the sorts of indicators that we have for problem gambling is things like marital breakdown, a lot of the time debt, significant debt where you're not able to pay your rent or the mortgage, losing your home, losing your job. Those sorts of things are, what we often think of as problem gambling, but it might not be so relevant for young people. Not to say that young people don't experience significant problems and consequences of their gambling problems, but it might just look a little bit different for these people. For younger people, they might understand it and relate to it and deal with it in a bit of a different way. Skip over that because I'm a little conscious of our time. So generally the aim of the study was to examine the temporal benchmarks in informal gambling recovery pathways with attention to the broader context of the experience for individuals and to the experiences of young adults particularly. Okay, so the research questions. We were interested in learning about how gamblers recognise that they have that their behaviour has become harmful or problematic. That has already been looked at a little bit in the literature in the past, and but we wanted to start there and to get an understanding for these particular participants. How did they recognise that problem? And then once they recognised that they had a problem, were perhaps motivated to do something about it, how did they actually move from a recognition of having a problem over to actually doing something about the problem? So, in other words, what, when and why gamblers will address their problems, and what sorts of resources and strategies will they try to use in order to assist that informal recovery process. And then what are all the sort of situations around them that influence that process? So their own perceptions, their own personal, individual thought processes and understanding, and what are the sort of influences from their family members, workplace, other sort of contextual factors that might shape the way that they go about recovery processing. And then having a look at the differences between the narratives of younger adults and those of older adults. So as you can see, we're looking at the temporal benchmarks. We're really looking at this as a process of recovery. So in order to have a look at that, the way that things might change over time, for example, we wanted to hear people's stories of how they developed a problem, how they recognised they had a problem, and what they did about it, and up to the present day. So for that, narrative interviews were really useful. It's a process where you simply ask a person to tell their story. So we ask them to do exactly that. Tell me when you started to gamble, when it became problematic, and everything that you've experienced up to the present day. So through that, we can see the way that individual also understands their problem and their recovery from that problem, what motivated them, what challenged them throughout the process, and all the personal, social, economic, environmental factors that were influencing that process over time, the way that all of those things might have interplayed during the process and changed over time as well. Okay, so moving on to recruitment. Just very briefly, we had two different methods of recruitment for older participants and for younger adult participants. With the older adults, we simply put in an advertisement in a popular Victorian newspaper on a Saturday in the sports section. We thought there'll be a few gamblers perhaps reading that section, and that actually worked out to be quite successful. And then with the young adults, we tried a couple of different methods, as well as putting up an advertisement in Facebook and in Gumtree. We did actually, which I should have there, recruit a couple of participants from a previous study, well, actually mentioned there in the second dot point. That was from my PhD, which was conducted a few years earlier. We were able to recontact some participants there and invite them to this study. So in the end, we had 32 adults from Victoria who had reported attempting to recover from gambling problems without the support of a professional. There were approximately 14 people aged 18 to 30, and that's how we define the young adult age group, and 18 people in the 40 to 79 older adult age group. The primary activity that people had a problem with was the pokies, as many people would probably expect. But then racing and casino table games are also a real issue for these people, including, or maybe even particularly for younger people. So I might just sort of make the note, because I get asked quite a lot about sports betting, online gambling. That actually wasn't the primary problem activity for most people. There were very few people who had that sort of issue, or it was secondary. What was also really good about this sample is that we did have participants with quite a range of problem gambling severity index scores, and that was not so much an indicator, as we understand from their narratives explaining their experiences. It wasn't so much that the participants had not experienced significant problems so much, but in fact that it was more of a demonstration of the level of recovery that participants had been able to achieve up to the time of the interviews. So I'll just briefly go through how people recognised that they had a problem. So these sorts of factors as well, I think, are more of, indicators that are sort of red flags for people, to let things that either let them know or in their narratives let me know as they're telling their story to me that their gambling had become problematic. So one is, I won't spend too much time on it because it's quite well known, gambling intensity. They were talking about losing control, that is gambling more often, spending more time gambling, and in particular expenditure. So gambling with a lot more money than they expected to, gambling their winnings, and borrowing money was seen as, they would mention that as a real indicator in trying to explain to me how bad their problem had become. Was even borrowing the money. That's sort of some other level of severity. And stealing money was a lot less common, and that was seen as an indicator of very severe gambling. Gambling with multiple credit cards was not all that unusual. That was also another indicator, and maxing out those credit cards, and of course using money allocated for other essential things like paying the rental, mortgage, groceries, bills. Gambling alone, some people always gambled alone, but it sometimes was the case that they started out gambling socially and then moved on to gambling on their own, and that in their narratives was a way of demonstrating increasing severity of problems. Once they start gambling on their own, then that seemed to be a real problem. And I suppose, in the same sort of way, some people were trying to explain that their problem was not as severe as other people's. Yes, they had a problem, but I'm not like those other guys in the venue who gamble on their own. So they try to say, they'll say that they still meet up with people in the venue, they still have some kind of a social scene at the venue, so that they try to say that demonstrates they don't really have as much of a problem compared to the other people at the venue who walk in there on their own, gamble for hours on their own, don't speak to anybody at all and leave. I suppose it's kind of arguable whether that is necessarily objectively problematic or less problematic or not, but it's certainly the way that they talk about it. And making compromises to gamble. So, this particular participant here talked about putting so much time and energy, or not putting time and energy into other things like getting a girlfriend, exercising, and instead spending their time gambling, putting all your concentration into something that's ruining your life, and then you forget about the other things in life. Again, now chasing losses and wins, for me this was really quite interesting because often in the literature we talk about chasing losses, and chasing losses is one of the indicators in problem gambling screens that we have. However, really for these participants, they often sort of they didn't really make much of a distinction between chasing losses and chasing wins, as you can see in that quote there. They will, chase losses, or chase wins, perhaps I should say. So they'll be trying to win money. They win money. They put that money straight into the machine or back into whatever gambling activity they're doing, and then they lose that money and they're trying to chase their losses and chase their wins, and it's just money and it's just gambling and it's all one in a sense. But it is just a cycle where they're a self-perpetuating cycle. And just as a side note, to an extent, people really did mention that alcohol and drug use was used in conjunction with gambling, and that intensified their chasing. People talked about it making them vulnerable to gambling and leading them to stupid mistakes. Okay, so we saw two different narratives about in relation to recognising a problem. So now I'm sort of talking more about when those behavioural indicators that I've just talked about accumulate to a point where people acknowledge that they really do have a problem here, and it's probably something that they need to do something about, rather than, you know, those other indicators can sometimes be, you know, red flags of, oh, maybe this is not quite great, but this is about them recognising that they really probably need to do something. So it's, at this moment, it's about those red flags accumulating to a crisis point for this particular narrative pathway, the externally driven problem recognition narrative. So there's some kind of confrontation from other people, often their family members, but it could be an employer, most likely to be a friend, where this person comes to them and says, this is awful, you've really reached a point where you've got a very serious problem here. Or there's some kind of crisis event, so they not just lose a significant amount of money, but they might have driven themselves into significant debt. That could be tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt. I've certainly heard stories of that, and I'm sure many of the people in the audience have heard that as well. And these particular people, you know, who express this narrative really talked about feeling overwhelmed and consumed by gambling and the problems that they were experiencing. The second narrative, there were two narratives, and the second was a self-recognised recovery narrative. So for these people, it was that their gambling had now become incongruent with their self-image. They talked about being a controlled person. They just felt like, you know, it was excessive. As I said, I'm normally a controlled person, I'm an intelligent person, I'm a hard-working person. You know, people have these sort of, you know, self-ideas of themselves, and gambling to this amount, losing this amount of money, spending that much time gambling, prioritising gambling over other things was incongruent with their image. For young people in particular, they might have also recognised it as being incongruent with their ambitions. So perhaps, and also when they compare themselves to their friends, so it might be that their friends were saving up to buy a house, or in fact had bought a house now, and they weren't doing this. So it was now, the gambling was impinging on their lifestyle and their ambitions, so that they weren't able to sort of be and become the adult that they thought they would be or wanted to be. One of the things that we're really interested in finding out with this project as well was that moment where, you know, you move from recognition of having a problem and being motivated to do something about it, to then actually doing something about it, that impetus for change. There was a great study by Anderson, Reith and Goethe a few years ago in Scotland, where they ran quite a similar project to this, but they acknowledged that they hadn't actually really been able to observe and articulate that process of change, or that moment of change, you know, whatever it looks like. So we're really interested in getting that turning point. Okay, so we did, and were able to articulate the impetus for recovery and the way that people manage their recovery process. And again, we recognised two different narrative pathways. I'll start off by articulating the self-directed recovery pathway. So for these people, they actually demonstrated a great level of agency in their recovery. So these people really felt that they made a decision to, you know, either reduce their gambling or stop gambling, and they were then in control, the agents of this change, of this recovery process. While they did get a lot of, you know, support from other people, they were the ones who were actually seeking out that support and managing the relationships with everybody and the resources that they had over the period. and in that sense they're self-directed in their recovery process. And for these people, their recovery goal was actually not just to reduce their gambling or stop gambling, to reduce the consequences of their gambling. If you recall, that was the definition that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. For these guys, it was actually about bringing in really positive things into their life, achieving their personal goals, achieving congruence with their self-image, achieving their ambitions, so being able to go overseas, improve their careers, save up money so that they can buy a house, buy a new car. It was about taking control of their life and becoming that adult that they wanted to become. Oh, and I say adult because it was often young people. I have young people in my mind, although older adults really did also demonstrate self-directed recovery. For these people, it was about I think I'll get to that in a moment actually, but I'll do that later. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, well, this is that slide. So for younger people in particular, it was about working towards their milestones. For older adults, it was about new roles. That was what I was about to say, of them wanting to, for the older adults, in quite a number of my participants had been gambling for a very long time, some of them from adolescence. They wanted to leave behind that, the gambler self, the gambler lifestyle is the way that they talked about it. It was a lifestyle, it was a period of their life, whether it was 5 years or 25 years. And develop a new lifestyle, purchase a house, build a family. This was sometimes 50-year-old men who had been gambling since they were 16 years old, for example, and now they've decided they want to settle down. That means stopping gambling so that they can have money, so that they can have, get married, raise a child, have a house, and have that kind of lifestyle rather than the gambling, drinking kind of lifestyle they were having before. People of this narrative also really felt that they were responsible for the successes of their recovery process. They were really very proud of the achievements that they had made, and they were able to own those achievements because they felt, they had initiated the recovery process, they were managing it, and so they were also able to take the credit for it. And interestingly, there were a couple of participants who mentioned that they really didn't like the idea of self-exclusion because they saw it as devaluing this choice that they had made not to gamble. It would reduce their sense of agency in their recovery. This wasn't the case for all of them, but I thought it was interesting to note that there were a few participants who mentioned this. These are just a couple of quotes to illustrate that. Reaching that milestone in age. A lot of my friends are moving on with their lives. Some are travelling overseas, working overseas, getting married, getting hitched, buying a home. I'm undecided, I'm at that scene type of mentality. I took a step back and I said, this can't continue. I'm either going to end up broke or worse, who knows? And then this from an older person in their 60s. I've got, I'd say, 30 years more of my life. I can start changing a bit by bit and just not having the gambling, but replacing the gambling with something else that I can think is a positive in my life sort of thing. And that's by helping other people. I found the food bank and I applied, and I've been there for over 3 years now, and then I do volunteering down the bowling club, and I volunteered this morning. And so there were also quite a few people, particularly of the older group, who mentioned also wanting to give back to their community and connecting with their community. So it's all about bringing really positive things into their lives, creating positive things. Externally directed recovery. So this group is more the traditional sort of idea that we have, I think, of recovery, follows more the definition that was given early on at the beginning of the presentation, whereby they demonstrate quite a low level of agency in their recovery. They're really very dependent on the support of family, friends, employers, in some cases employers. That was quite interesting. And what do I have here? They require a significant change in circumstances that meant that the severity of the gambling harms was now greater than the challenges of recovery. So this is where they need somebody to come in and say, look, I can help you out with this, so that it's easier to go through recovery. They have somebody to help them out with that. And that process is not as difficult as it is to manage the consequences of their gambling. And the person helping them, or the team of people helping them, is often a bit of a team of people, but if possible, they really need to employ an enforced interventionist approach to help these people. So this is where the goal of recovery is about reducing the consequences of gambling, reducing the gambling itself. Of course, it puts quite a strain on the people who are trying to help them. So this is, as you can see, it really does fit in quite a lot better with that original definition that we had. Interestingly, it really does, the person who is supporting them, or the people who are supporting them, do need to be really valued by that person. So an employer is very much valued because it's where they get their income from, and their ability to gamble or their ability to live. Sometimes hearing that from their partner, or having their partner say, look, I'll help you, I'll do what I can, is not necessarily enough. Sometimes they love their gambling more than the partner, to be honest. There were quotes like that. So this illustrates that. Before my employer said something to me, if somebody had spoken to me and said, oh, look, listen, you need to do something about your gambling, you say, oh, rubbish, I'm fine, I can control it. But until somebody sort of puts you aside and sits you down with you at the table and sort of says, well, look, we're prepared to help you, but you need to help yourself because you do have a problem. And I think, okay, maybe I do, yeah. So you need somebody to sort of actually speak to you and say, this is it, we're prepared to do this for you if, you will do this and this. So you can see where they really rely on somebody else's support. As I said, families are often the primary support person. Sometimes it can be friends and employers, but it's often family. With younger adults, it tended to be, if they were living at home, they would rely on their parents. If they were married or partnered, then the partners were their primary support person. Quite a number of older people did rely on their adult children and other family members. With the self-directed recovery group, a number of them really mentioned that honesty with others was really, really important. It was actually sort of, in a sense, of part of the turning point of their recovery, of actually saying to them, look, not only that I have a problem, but actually maintaining that level of honesty and saying and being accountable to their family and friends by telling them, if they had gambled, so perhaps for some people they might have been simply wanting to reduce their gambling. So they had to be accountable to another person and tell them how much they had actually gambled that day. So, where $50 might be fine and acceptable, so that person would say, oh yeah, cool, whatever. But if they had gambled $500, they had to be honest, tell them I gambled $500, and actually hear that you're such an idiot comment from their family. That was actually really helpful for them. They really felt that it strengthened their relationships, reinforced their behaviour through pro-social sort of activities. The self-directed recovery group also, they really wanted to strengthen their relationships with their family and friends and their social networks. That was something that was really very important to them. With the externally directed recovery group, as I said, they really did need an interventionist role from families, so it's very stressful, very confusing time for them. For their family members, the family members don't always know exactly what to do and how to do it, and have to be persistent on, every single day, be there to hold that person accountable, to take care of their finances, to make sure that they're not going to a gambling venue, they're going somewhere else. There was a case of a woman's sister-in-law who would pick her up and take her to the supermarket each time she needed to go to the supermarket because nearby there was a pokies venue. And they knew that if she was to go to the supermarket, she'd end up stopping by the pokies venue either before she went shopping or afterwards, quite often before she went shopping, which meant she would have limited money to do her shopping with. Interestingly, with the externally directed group, which I think is really important, is sometimes family members would step in and take control of their finances. This would actually almost give the gambler the right to gamble with everything else that was left over. So they would, the partner perhaps, let's say, would pay for all the bills. And so then they were at least making sure that the essentials in the household were taken care of and they weren't going to lose everything. That then almost gave the gambler the freedom, let's say, to go ahead and gamble with everything else that was left over. So then it actually then made them feel that it wasn't really such a problem, and it was giving them the okay to continue gambling. So that critical threshold that they need to reach a crisis point to recognise and acknowledge that they have a problem and need to do something about it was actually extended through this harm minimisation strategy of the partner. So that's where that kind of approach can actually be a little bit, can be sort of counterproductive. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, employers did take on an interventionist role in a couple of cases. And it was actually both for older people and for younger people, and it was very, very effective. For these people, that they really listened to their employers. It was really important what their employers had to say. And the fear of loss of income obviously can lead them to that crisis point where they recognise that they need to do something about it. So the resources for self-directed recovering gamblers to assist them to be able to achieve those goals that they're looking for, those life milestones, that change of lifestyle, is essential. I did speak to a couple of people who didn't really have access to those resources. So while you could see that they were and wanted to be self-directed in their recovery, it was actually extremely difficult for them to do so because they didn't really have the kind of support that they needed from family and friends. They had some support, but it wasn't that ideal sort of circumstance. They needed to be articulate. They needed the education to be articulate, to know how to access resources, to have opportunities for the sort of career that they want, that is also then going to allow them to save money to purchase the house. All of those sorts of opportunities require certain resources. So we need to make sure that those people have that kind of support. Also just, practical tips, perhaps access to sessions on how to re-establish their relationships with people. As I mentioned, those social relationships and networks were really essential for self-directed recovering gamblers. They want to feel that they're able to do that themselves, so it's not being spoon-fed to them, that they've got access to information on how to go about doing it, or perhaps workshops or something that assists that process. With the externally directed recovering gamblers, so practical advice and support for families is essential. Obviously, families need to be there for this person on a daily basis usually. So, it takes an enormous amount of their personal resources, financial resources. So they need to be supported in being able to support the gambler. Perhaps even be able to have a professional person that they can go to provide support. Perhaps that means being able to go to the bank, and there will be somebody at the bank who understands what needs to be done in order to get the finances for a problem gambler under control, that they can talk to, and who the family member can really talk to at the bank, and it can all be done easily and quickly for them. It's one example. I'm sure there's many others. As mentioned, employees can play a role here as well, and so having workplace policies as a part of employee assistance policies, many employers already have some kind of policy around supporting people with mental health issues, stress, a whole range of different issues, and gambling can be a part of that. And so these people might also be more likely to eventually present to counselling services, because they do need somebody else to give them that help, that intensive level of help, and that's something that counselling services obviously do. And given that in the past research has often recruited from counselling services, from Gamblers Anonymous, that kind of thing, it may be that that's why this narrative is, the externally directed narrative is the one that we're more familiar with. They need really regular contact, so it might even be things like sending regular text messages, emails to people, so that they stay on track, they feel really supported, they feel that somebody is there for them, and yeah, it all needs to be a very positive kind of environment for them. And things like, assertiveness training. There has actually been some work already in this area with problem gamblers in teaching them to be assertive, to be able to, and I suppose be able to gradually have more agency in their lives. Develop some goals. There were people who were saying things like, it never even occurred to me that I could actually go on a holiday. They had a friend who intervened and said, hey, look, actually, if you put aside $100 a week, whatever it was, put aside some money, then, in 5 weeks' time, we can go on a holiday to Queensland, or it was something like that. And they said, look, my friend did this for me, and I honestly never realised that I can save up money and go on a nice little holiday. That changed this person's world. They then realised that there were possibilities in life that they had honestly not realised that. So supporting them in recognising this and showing them how they can work towards those sorts of goals as well can be actually transformative. There's a few limitations that I do need to acknowledge. Obviously, it's a qualitative study with, we only got to speak to 32 people, so of course the findings cannot be generalised to the population of adults who are attempting informal recovery, but the narratives do, give some really interesting insight into that lived experience, into and what shapes the experience of informal recovery. So that there's certainly more research to be done from here on, but this was I think a really fascinating beginning. And we mostly spoke to people in metropolitan Melbourne. There were a few people from regional areas, but not quite so many. We didn't specifically try to recruit participants from regional areas or anything like that. So that's something that can be done in the future, and of course in different jurisdictions you may get different narratives, partly through the different sorts of support services that are available, the sorts of education campaigns that are being run to educate people about gambling problems and about recovery processes. And also, it was a cross-sectional design, so a prospective design would actually be fantastic so that we could, actually observe that whole process from the beginning, the recognition of the problem all the way through, and also, in the years following, resolution, and perhaps actually get a little bit more of a better idea of what resolution of a gambling problem really means as well. For example, I spoke with one person, I can remember, who said that they had not really gambled, or had not gambled for quite a number of years. So I would have to say it was at least 5 years from memory. But they were still experiencing the consequences of gambling. So they actually still scored, I think, 1 or something on the PGSI. So it just goes to show that, when you look at it simply quantitatively, from the way that we've been looking at recovery so far, it wouldn't, by looking at, we have to acknowledge that the consequences of problem gambling can last for many years past the cessation of gambling itself. So recovery is not simply the cessation of gambling. I think that is one of the key messages of this project, and that has implications for a whole range of different areas of gambling and problem gambling in terms of treatment and evaluation, research implications. And there was a bit of a bias towards male participants, although as we know, males are more likely to be problem gamblers, but still it would be good to be able to speak to a few more females of different ages as well and different backgrounds. Yes, there wasn't a great deal of ethnic diversity either, I might mention. How are we doing for time? Do I have much? Probably not so much time. Okay. So going back to the fact that there were these different recovery pathways recognised, which is quite new to the area. And I'll take this moment to stress that people who were self-recognised a problem did not necessarily then go on to be self-directed in their recovery process, nor were externally recognised problem narratives then continued on to explain an externally directed narrative. You know, you might, there was one case where there was a girl who was very externally recognised problem, who somehow, you know, it was sort of amazing hearing her story. She, there was like some kind of switch went off, and then rather than being externally directed, continuing on to rely on others, you know, quite a lot, she just switched over and became very self-directed in her recovery and really took control of her life, and it was quite remarkable. And, you know, there were a few of those sorts of stories. So I think that's also really important to stress here, because although, you know, sometimes people were self-recognised and moved into self-directed recovery, but yeah, not necessarily. So there were different the application and management of strategies and resources will differ according to the recovery pathway. So yes, obviously we need to support people. We need to first recognise, you know, whether they're self-directed or externally directed, recognise that they're going to be motivated by different things. They're going to have a different goal for recovery in mind, and the way that they should be supported through that process, or the way that they're going to want to be supported, whether it's by a family member, an employer, counselling services, just, you know, information brochures, websites, need to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, that they might be looking for different sorts of things, and you want to find out what is this particular person actually really needing and what are they wanting to work towards through their recovery. So tailoring that process. And yes, that's the end.
Probably can't see me, guys. Let's see, I'm here in the room.
I might move back to the phone. There we go. Probably a nicer screen.
So we can do some questions. We've got about 5 minutes or so.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I talked a bit too much.
Yeah. I did that too. So what I'll do, guys, I muted most people's mics during that, so we're getting just a little bit of background noise. So I'll unmute everyone who's got a mic or on the phone, and so you've got the option of either speaking your question, but let's just try and take turns, or you can type it into the chat and we'll be able to see it that way. And I've moved the keyboard away, so hopefully you won't hear any more of my nice strong keystrokes while I'm typing. But I'll just quickly go through and sort of unmute people. So do bear in mind that if you've got any background noise, we'll now be able to hear you. And people can begin asking questions if they would like to, or if you don't want to talk, you can type it into the chat, you know.
I might just mention as well, I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if people wanted to as well, and, you know, to ask more questions, have a bit of a longer discussion.
Yeah, and I'd also back up that we do understand that people do need to go. So if you do need to log out, by all means go for it. But if anyone's got any questions, now is the time.
Can you hear Diana from South Australia?
Oops. Sorry, was someone trying to talk there?
Yeah, Diana from South Australia. Can you hear me? Or?
Sort of.
Sort of, but fire away.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
We missed the very beginning. But I'm interested just to clarify whether or not self-directed recovery had some correlation with severity of problems.
Yes, I don't think so. I suppose you could very easily think that self-directed people had less severe problems and externally directed people had more severe problems, and I really don't think that was the case at all. The descriptions of people's problems, the way that the problem developed and the severity of the problems didn't really differ according to whether they were self-directed or externally directed. So that was actually very interesting as well. That's a really good point to make.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was more to do, I think, with the person themselves, perhaps something about their personalities. I'm not sure, just hypothesising. But yeah, certainly also about the resources that they had available to them. And yeah, it was sort of about who they are, as in, the goals that they had for their lives and whether they could see a different sort of future for themselves, if they could see that they, wanted to be travelling, or they wanted a better career, or they wanted to own a house and have a family. That then made them, and if they had friends around them who were supportive and also achieving those things, that I think then helped them to be more self-directed in their recovery. So I think it's about resources, personal goals, social networks, all of those sorts of factors working together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions I'd like to pose?
No?
No? Okay, well, that being the case, thank you, Alice. Just got to type back no. And that being the case, on behalf of everyone, because I'm sure we would, I'd like to thank Sophie for the... Oh, quick question. One quick question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. One quick question. Who was that? Let's have a look. That's whoever JC is. Fire away.
Oh.
I just want to read that out, Sophie.
Yeah. Did you explore where the participants picked up the strategies from? Yes. So that's a good point, and I didn't really talk about that much. I suppose with the narratives and a narrative inquiry, you do need to sit back very much as a researcher and let them tell their story in their way. It's very much about the technique of narrative interviewing. And I didn't really probe a lot on this particular area, but generally people did talk about it. So people did go online often. There were quite a few people, particularly younger people, but not exclusively, who went online looking for strategies, looking for methods. The strategies were often, what people have talked about of, just avoiding the venue. So that's the kind of thing that, there's this bad thing, it's called gambling. I do it at the casino, so I just don't go to the casino. So, there were a couple of people who worked in the city, for example, so they would take a different route home, so they didn't even have to look at the casino. They made sure that they had friends who were meeting them at work, in the CBD, straight after work, so that they immediately had something to do and somewhere to be and someone who would ask them, where are you? So that they wouldn't end up going to the casino. And I think family and friends also gave them some advice and said, oh, hey, look, since this is going on, then, I'll hold on to the money for you. But yeah, it didn't sound like people really talk to others so much. From memory, it was mostly about going to websites and then doing what sort of felt logical and instinctively the right thing to do. But yeah, I think that's actually something that perhaps we could have a little study that looks at that a bit more specifically. Yeah.
There is a question now.
There's something. Are any participants who are identified as from cold or migrant background involved in the study? So I didn't actually specifically ask about that. I suppose you could tell from a couple of names, or actually there were a couple of people who mentioned it as they were talking about it. That wasn't a great feature of it. It was what did come up a couple of times were things like people who were from a cultural background where they would say things like, oh, well, in my community group, everybody wants to know what you're doing. It's one big extended family, it's one big community, and so I would try not to tell too many people too much of what was going on, because I don't want the whole world to know what's happening in my life and to be discussing it all the time. And on the other hand, by the same token, others might say, I get a lot of support from those people in my networks. But that's about all. So yeah, as I mentioned, that was one of the limitations of the study, that we didn't, specifically look at people of cold backgrounds and the way that particular cultural backgrounds might impact on that recovery process. But from those few examples that I have, it didn't seem to make an enormous difference to the experience. It didn't really come through as a different sort of narrative pathway, the way that I had identified that with the self-directed and the externally directed group. I think we've got another one. No, just some thank yous. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. As I said in the chat, we'll put a video up of the webinar on the Foundation website at some point as well, and we'll check with Sophie if we can get the slides included as well. But cool. Thank you. Cool. Thanks for the clarification. Thank you all for participating. We really appreciate it, and thank you for your time. The other thing I might do is I'll get Etty, since this is our first time using this technology, I might get him to send something out to you and just figure out how it works and whether it was good, bad, indifferent, what we can do better. That'd be great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Okay. We can't stop that video.